Okay, for those of you that I do not know yet, and most of you I do, I'm Kristen Ross Cully with the Jesuit Schools Network Conference Office, where I serve as Director of Inquiry and New Ventures. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us live, and then for those that are going to be watching it recorded as well. We're grateful for your time. On behalf of the JSN's Conference Office, welcome to our latest Ignatian Inquiry virtual coffee shop. The JSN, as you know, really seeks to be a supportive resource to our schools. And this virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, and to engage. We're really eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of all of our work in Jesuit education. And we envision our particular brand of Ignatian Inquiry to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. And that's exactly what we'll do today. But before we get started with our program this afternoon, why don't we begin as we do with an opening prayer? So if I can ask us all to center ourselves and to be reminded that in being together today, we really are in the presence of God. So in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And let us pray for all of those that are struggling in our communities and in our world, especially during the holidays, which can be a difficult time for so many. Thought it would be nice to share a reading from Fratelli Tutti, which says this: no one can face life in isolation. We need a community that supports and helps us, in which we can help one another to keep looking ahead. How important it is to dream together. By ourselves, we risk seeing mirages, things that are not there. Dreams, on the other hand, are built together. So let us dream then as a single human family, as fellow travelers sharing the same flesh, as children of the same earth, which is our common home. Each of us bringing the richness of his or her beliefs and convictions, each of us with his or her own voice, brothers and sisters all. And we pray in particular today for the grace of imagination, of creativity, and of patience. Amen. So let's begin with our session today, which we are calling What's Your Story? For some context here, for everyone who's joining us, in support of the Universal Apostolic Preferences, how can we as educators journey with the youth, accompany young people in creation of a hope-filled future? One way is through Counterstory. As Pedro Arrupe said, to be drugged by the comforts of privilege is to become contributors to injustice, as silent beneficiaries of the fruits of injustice. How can we journey with the youth in a world that has become increasingly fractured from war, hatred, jealousy, and animosity? One way is through the power of story and storytelling using the Counterstory methodology. Counterstory methodology is the narration of experiences of people and communities that are often hidden, suppressed, or reinterpreted by a culturally dominant group. It is a tool for exposing, for analyzing, and for challenging the dominant narratives of race, class, gender, politics, poverty, pandemics, and so many other core categories that underline the maintenance of social power. By using this powerful tool with our students, we can actively unmute the voices that have traditionally been silenced, and create empathy and compassion among this generation, building bridges of hope and reconciliation for the future. Every voice matters. Every story matters. And these beautiful words were written by our presenter today, Cora M. Antonio, who serves as Assistant Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Religious Studies teacher, and Filipino Student Association moderator at Bellarmine College Preparatory in San Jose, California. Cora has been a Catholic educator for over 15 years, working in diverse populations throughout the California Bay Area. She has a BA in Ethnic Studies from UC Berkeley and an MA in Systematic Theology from the Graduate Theological Union, also in Berkeley. She has had a passion for doing diversity work since her youth and has recently focused her work around storytelling and the power of personal narratives. Her recent work around Counterstory has been used as a vehicle of social justice to promote the dignity of every human being. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Cora, who is the reason that we're all here today. So thank you, Cora.
Thank you so much. That was very kind of you. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. The plan is to just go through a short presentation and then open up for questions. Attempt to share the screen. Can you guys see my screen? Yeah, okay. And if as questions come up, go ahead and throw them into the meeting chat. And I think Kristen is going to help me, so we can make sure we get to those questions at the end. So I've been doing this work for about 3 or 4 years, and it just started out of prayer. I have this passion about storytelling and about diversity. So I asked my younger brother who works at Stanford, and he's the director of Asian American Studies. And I asked him about, hey, I need resources about this idea I have. And he said, oh, here's some resources. So I cannot get credit for this. It was my brother who's helped me along the way. And this is the result. So I believe that story and storytelling is very powerful. I get the question often, and I've heard it in doing diversity work, how do I diversify my text? How do I diversify the curriculum? And it can be in any subject. Those questions primarily come from English and social studies, but as I've done the work, I see it as applicable across the board. And the answer is right under our nose. It's a lot easier than we thought. The diversity, or the way to diversify our texts and to promote equity and inclusion, is through the power of story by our own students, starting there and then moving, of course, globally around the world. So again, focusing on the apostolic preferences, and I have thought about the power of story and in the Jesuit context of using it to journey with our youth, and the multiplicity and the intersectionality of our youth, as well as walking with the excluded. And I think oftentimes walking with the excluded, our students especially, and it could be adults, we think of migrants as pictured here, or minorities. But I have learned as I've done this work that in our classrooms, every student has a story, and every student has been an outcast or excluded in some way. And that's what I'm hoping to share with you all today, to elevate the voices of our students. Now, just a little science. If you don't know, I did some research on the power of storytelling and how it affects our brains. So there are a number of things that are happening, but there's it's not oxytocin, it's oxytocin and dopamine that are being activated. And I'm not going to be too complicated here because I am not a scientist. But at the end of the day, there's this mirroring. I don't know if you guys have heard of mirror neurons, but what happens like when you watch a movie and you're really getting involved into that movie, or you see someone cry in the movie and you want to cry, or you see somebody going into the house that they shouldn't go into in a scary movie and you're like, don't open the door. It's because of what's happening on your brain, in your brain. You're mirroring what's happening there. And for us, it starts to build feelings, right? We have feelings for the characters we see in the movies or what we read in books. And we start to have compassion for them, passion and compassion. And this is what is happening. And the work around this has shown that it creates empathy, which is why storytelling can be used as a tool of social justice, all right? Empathy will cause people to go from, students understand they need to do service and doing service hours. That sounds great, but moving from that into action, moving from being a spectator into a participator, okay? It is not necessarily seeing yourself in another person's story, but understanding the pain or better understanding the difference, what is happening there. I like to say that it animates statistics. And what I'm giving you now is a bunch of statistics. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to share some stories. But we can read statistics about racism, critical race theory, homophobia, and, read all, these disasters that are happening and how mass shootings are on the rise. But that will only be changed by stories, by people's personal narratives. So just a little bit of background. Dominant narratives, for those of you who don't know, they are the paradigms or memes or metaphors that which we swim in. We swim in them and we breathe them in and out every single day. It's perpetuated by media, by all the powerful institutions, education, healthcare, the legal system, immigration law, you name it, right? These are things that, and they've become so normalized that we don't even realize. You and I, every day I live, I find out there's, oh my gosh, I have actually bought into these dominant narratives that cage folks, all right? They are pillars for some and they cage others. We've all heard in like history, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And I've made it, if you didn't make it, it's your fault, and then we buy into that, like the metaphor of, or the dominant narrative that if I just work hard, go to a good school, get my degree, go to college, I will be successful. But see, that narrative falls apart. It only works for some because it ends up oppressing others. Okay, this is where Counterstories in. These dominant narratives support some and cage others. So I'm going to play a short scene for those of you who don't know. This is, how many of you guys seen Stand and Deliver? Okay, old. Anybody old like me? I'm old. Okay, so this is based on a true story in East LA high school, predominantly Latinx. There's this magnificent teacher who comes in and he is teaching the AP Calculus course. And everybody in his class has a Spanish surname. Everybody is of Hispanic descent. And they all pass. They all pass. And the results get questioned by the College Board.
I guarantee you will be questioned.
Oops, let's start that up, guys.
I'd like to see the proof of wrongdoing. I would like to see the tests.
Let me reiterate, there has been no proof of wrongdoing here, only a suspicion of cheating.
In this country, one is innocent until proven guilty, not the other way around.
If you're so confident of your students' abilities, why not encourage them to retest?
Why should I?
If they don't, everyone will assume they cheated.
Everyone will assume they cheated if they do. I want to see the test, please.
We're going around in circles here. Mr. Escalante, we're psychometricians. They're to the point of boring. We're not out to get anybody here.
Not so fast. If this was a simple situation of two students cheating, that's one thing. But by making a blanket accusation, you're saying that there was a conspiracy. Every conspiracy has a leader. Who better qualified to be the leader than their teacher?
Mr. Escalante, nobody's accusing you here of anything.
The school, the parents, the entire community.
Scores aside, I guarantee you will be questioned regardless of the school.
Yes, but if this was Beverly Hills High School, they wouldn't have sent you two to investigate.
Escalante, hope you're not insinuating that we haven't earned our position here. Because no one's giving me a damn thing. I suggest you're letting your emotions get the best of you.
If no one has given you a damn thing, you should not be taken away from my kids.
The identity of the students were concealed until it was determined that irregularities existed.
Those scores would have never been questioned if my kids did not have Spanish surnames and come from barrio schools. You know that.
All right. We've been patiently explaining our position and listening to your complaints. For now, our conversation is over.
There's something going on here that nobody is talking about. And you know what it is.
No one has the right to accuse me of racism.
No one has the right to accuse me of racism. I know well how to spell discrimination. I thought this was over a long time ago. Are you doing this to my kids?
There are two kinds of racism, Mr. Escalante. Singling out a group because they're members of a minority and not singling out a group because they're members of a minority.
My kids could teach you a thing or two, Johnny.
I'm gonna call security if you can't control yourself, Escalante.
Go for it.
Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. And for those of you who have not seen the movie, they do retest and they do all pass again. And when I do this class, I teach this class on Counterstory with my seniors, here at Bellarmine, I said, well, if everybody at Bellarmine in the AP Calculus class, and you could apply that to your own context, if everybody passed, would they question our school? And of course, the answer is no. And that's where we go into power and privilege, as Arrupe has written in his book.
I would just like to see the...
Going on. I'm not going to show this, but I did want to bring it to your attention. Many of you have seen The Danger of a Single Story. It's very, 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 very popular. If you're using that in your own context with your team or your students, choose a little bit of it, but it goes extensively into these dominant narratives and what they are and how they have power, literal power over people, including ourselves. So this brings us to Counterstories. So I'm going to run through some 4 technical definitions to give you some background on Counterstory and what it is. I don't know how many of you have heard the term before. So first of all, there are 4 kinds of stories. The first one is stock stories. Stock stories are things that are perpetuated in dominant mainstream institutions. And there you can see schools, government, workplaces, in the media. It becomes those things that, again, have been normalized. And there are so many. It is not just on race again. It is on... it could be on sexual assault. It could be on, rape. It can be on disabilities, okay? These things are become so normalized that we don't even think twice. The second is called concealed stories. These are stories that have been told and passed on generation to generation, but not been published in any way, shape, or form. They're usually family history. And I use this example, how singing during, spirituals during the time of slavery, those actually had concealed stories in there. They're usually hidden from the public view until they are brought out in what is called a resistance story. So the third type of story is the resistance story. Those are the stories that we have been accustomed to. They challenge stock stories. Now, the danger with resistance stories, like you see on the screen there with Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman, what happens is the danger is they become stock stories. Okay, we see it as like, oh, this is the act that, like, Frederick Douglass's story is the single story that embodies slaves and from their perspective during the time in the 1800s. Okay, so that is the danger with resistance stories, which brings us to counter stories and the work that I do. Now, counter stories are deliberately constructed to challenge stock stories. So they are a resistance story, yes, but they continue to be constructed and shared, right? And their purpose is to amplify resistance stories and that everybody's story is different. They interrupt status quo. You're going to see a story by a student, an African-American student, I'm going to share with you. A lot of times if you even ask your students, they think, oh, racism, we don't really have it anymore. It's an anomaly at our school. And it's just one off. But until we continue to bring up these stories over and over again, we see that it is not. It is still, there are still dominant narratives around being Black or a Black male that we still swim in today. All right, so they work for change. Students get confused over that, so I go over that over and over again. Not very good right now when we talk about counter stories. Particularly from the perspective of not just Catholicism, but I think, as a Christian, there are so many verses around human dignity. Now, human dignity is something that is God-given, as you guys know, Imago Dei. It is not something that we give to each other. And that is something that we need to continue to teach our children as we journey with them and uphold these stories. The stories will continue to uphold dignity. And that is what we are called to do. you know, both in and out of our classrooms. And let me, when we get into the stories, you'll be able to see. So as mentioned, we live in a fractured world and things continue to happen. There was a shooting just wasn't it a couple of weeks ago, guys, like in Minnesota or Michigan, another school shooting. These things continue to happen. And I've learned that whenever there's conflict, it's not because oftentimes we can resolve conflict, but whenever, like, I'm in a meeting and I hear people going at it, it's because they feel like they're not being heard. So I don't know if you guys have been in meetings and they try to outshout each other. They get louder and louder and louder. It's because they feel like they're not being heard. You know, and I always tell my students, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. You should listen twice as much as you speak. So stories are a way for us to listen. So I'm going to give a quick counter story here, and this counter story is not about me. It is about my father, who's since passed away. So a lot of people know in the 1940s during World War II, the Japanese were interned here in the United States. What a lot of people don't know is that Americans were interned in the Philippines. And my grandfather was Filipino. He died in the Battle of Bataan. And my grandmother, white. Her name was Esther Showalter. And my dad was an only child. They were living in the Philippines when the war broke out. My dad was about 10. And Americans, the Japanese went around the Philippines and got Americans, the same thing that happened to the Japanese. And they put them into internment camps. And my dad was at the University of Santo Tomas in the Philippines from age 10 to 13 in an internment camp. They were separated by sex. So here you can see a picture of the all-male barracks. My brother found a book at the Stanford bookstore, and it was an old book. And actually what the arrow's pointing to there is my father, Ernesto Marcelino Antonio, and Esther Showalter Antonio, who is my grandmother. They were actually on the manifest when at the end of the war with the US victorious, they were let out of the internment camps and allowed to return. They came back to San Francisco, and their names were on the manifest of the ship. So when my dad came back, he was orphaned, put in a Catholic orphanage because for whatever reason, my grandmother did not feel like she could care for him. So my dad was an only child and orphaned at the age 13. He was in a Catholic orphanage, and he was put in foster home to foster home to foster home here in the Bay Area. It was, I think, about 6 years. He was in foster homes. And that is a whole other story about the foster system. He didn't talk a lot about it, to be honest with you. Nobody wants to adopt a disabled child. My dad was born with a birth defect. It's cerebral palsy. He only stood about 5'2", and he was on crutches. The whole time I knew him, it's my dad. That's the picture of him there on crutches in his youth. And he was a teen. People don't go to the orphanage to pick up teens who are disabled. And mind you, this is pre-Disabilities Act, okay? So he was pretty much neglected until an elderly Catholic couple in San Mateo went through the foster home when he was back in, and took the time to stop and listen to him and listen to his story, you know. They weren't able to have kids. They were elderly, had no children, and somebody had suggested, you know, why don't you consider adopting? So at age 16, they took my father into their home, and their names were Robert and Cora Church. I'm named after my dad's foster mother. They put him into a private school, all boys private school in San Mateo called Sarah High School. And he entered at age 16, finished by age 19. He started late. Now my dad had cerebral palsy. Is also, there's a spectrum of the way you can be disabled. He wasn't very mobile, but he was very, 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 very smart. So he finished high school in 3 years, and he graduated at the top of his class. at Sarah. And I have to say, to the all boys environment, I'm very appreciative of that, because, you know, there were no wheelchair ramps or anything like that at the time. So he would literally like jump on the back of, you know, his friends, and they would take him class to class on their backs to get him around the campus. And I think that's a beautiful story. When he was graduating, he was awarded a 4-year scholarship to Yale. But my father has this particular heart of just love despite what he's gone through. And his best friend, an Italian guy, his name's Arthur Mori, his best friend was second in line for the scholarship at Sarah. And he knew that my Uncle Art wanted to go to Yale. And so my dad turned down the scholarship to meet the need of his best friend. And so in that story itself, there are multiple narratives I hope that I've challenged about, you know, through, again, in that short context about disabilities. And that's a whole spectrum of things, about the internment camps, about being an orphan, and so on and so on. When I've shared this in my class, by the way, I thought the counter story I was sharing was flipping the narrative of maybe disabilities or the internment camps. And what I found out in our context, what floored my students was none of that. What floored my students was that he gave away his 4-year scholarship to Yale. And I was like, what? That's what you got out of that? But you can see, you know, you never know how the story is going to impact others. So as I close this presentation and open up to questions, I did want to share just a few examples I've been teaching this class now for about 4 years, and I've collected a number of stories from students. Like I said, they're right in your room. And when they turn in their counter story at the very end of the semester, I get permission from them to share their stories, because that has become my new textbook. I'm also flipping the narrative that you need to be published to have a valid story. I don't believe that. I believe that what they've turned in is powerful. So there are different examples here. How do I move this? Okay. So the first is from a white male. He said, the dominant narrative that I've dealt with for most of my life is that if your skin is of a lighter one, more white, and you speak French, then you must be French, or your family or ancestors must be from France. Sadly, I've dealt with and still deal with this dominant narrative. When people hear me speaking French with my parents, generally the first time for them to hear me speak French, they immediately assume my ethnic background and say, oh, are you French? Are your parents from France? What is annoying is that I get asked those two questions every single time someone hears me speak French for the first time. They assume that I'm of French descent. What frustrates me the most is, rather than asking how I learned how to speak French or what my ethnic background is, they immediately assume that I'm French and completely ignore my Lebanese roots. Guys, I have to tell you that this was an awakening for me from this story. I'm one of those persons who swam in that narrative and thought if you speak French, you must be from France. Okay, so I am guilty of that, but this definitely opened my eyes up to the Lebanese French. The next story is not about race. This one's about the LGBTQ. Let me see if I'm skipping one. Nope, this one's about race. And it's from an African-American student here at Bellarmine who's since graduated. Microaggressions and instances of racism did not stop after middle school, but actually seemed to become more common in high school. Yes, at my school, where the overwhelming diversity of the school is constantly flaunted and marketed, and so many people believe racism doesn't exist for some reason. Despite this diversity, I have still heard people telling jokes, using words or slurs they shouldn't, or making assumptions about people based on their race. For example, someone who I once considered to be a close friend who happened to be Asian would regularly use the N-word around me, about me, and to me as a joke. He only started doing this towards the tail end of our friendship and claimed it was because we were close enough friends that I should know he doesn't mean it and not get offended. But how am I supposed to not get offended when I walk up to a group and you jokingly say, complete the sentence, or call the police? Okay, another very powerful story an excerpt from his story around race. And he goes on to explain much more about his hair, his skin color, and his more experiences he's had. This one's around the LGBTQ plus community. The student writes, my main point is that as a member of the LGBTQ plus community, I want to feel accepted by both straight and queer people and be seen as a person, not a novelty. I'm desperate to make connections because I have to. It's not as easy to make friends if they can't immediately know an essential part of my personal and sexual identity yet. If you are straight, I urge you to please think about the difficult thoughts that one in the LGBTQ plus community potentially goes through every day. Do I change my voice? Do I wear these clothes? How should I stand? How should I walk? How should I use my hands? Will this group of people accept me as my facade, but then reject me after I stop maintaining the facade? These are all questions that I had to think about. Going to an all-boys school definitely just intensified the general fear. And I have to tell you, every time I do this class, I might have 25 students. About a fourth of them, at least, will tell me an experience of sexuality or gender identity. The last one, guys, is about a disability. I was diagnosed, okay, that's improper English right there, with OCD. I had an incredibly inaccurate perception of what it was. I thought that it was a disorder that made people want to be clean, organized, and agitated if their clothes weren't folded or their pencils weren't straight. This perception of OCD is really common, as it is the only one that media seems to show. However, at its core, OCD is a disorder that is much more complex than that. When I tell people that I have OCD, sometimes they ask what it is like, and for a long time, I had trouble answering them. I felt pushed to explain myself in a way that fit their idea of the disorder so that I came off as more legitimate. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, that through sharing my story, people understand that their assumptions are often short-sighted. It makes others like me feel insufficient. I am much more than any of these labels. And I just loved that he ended with that. So guys, I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Thank you for your time, and I'm sorry that took long, but those are a few of the stories, and there's so much more. You know, working towards change. So that's it, guys. That's all I have for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cora. Thank you for sharing your story. I think probably everyone on the call joins me in saying that I really find the way you embrace this work with students to be both brave and inspiring. And I was thinking especially about how, you know, it's all of our calls as Ignatian educators to embrace the ideal of cura personalis. And I think we always think about that and care for students. One of the ways I've always thought about it is bringing who you are to your work with students and sharing that that person with your students and your colleagues. And I think you just showed us a terrific representation of that. So thank you. We'll move into some time here for some questions and answers from the group. And in addition to some specific questions that we hope that you have for Cora, and the chance just to share your insights and your feedback on what you just heard. To prime the pump a little bit, I'll ask you to reflect on a few things, maybe as you gather your thoughts. So as you were listening to Cora speak, what did you connect to? You know, where did you find yourself moved? Where did you feel joy? Perhaps where did you feel you were falling short? Or where did you feel kind of more anxious that maybe you weren't embracing the kind of work that Cora was saying here? So I'll give you a moment or two just to gather your thoughts. Thanks for the questions that are popping up in the chat box here too. And I'll get us started here. So Cora, I would say I loved the way you said that your students were floored by the Yale story. But for you as an educator, having done this for so long with so much experience, what was your greatest surprise in this work? Where was a point where you found yourself floored as you worked in this way with students?
Honestly, it's from working with the kids, with the students, and hearing them and hearing them their voices. And it is so empowering when we empower them, you know, that we take the time to listen to them. I think that oftentimes they're so focused on, you know, I need to go to college, I need to go to college, I need to do this, I need to do that. But taking the time to listen to them and their story it may or may not be about their education, that's been the most rewarding part of doing this work. And I wanted to add that, you know, in doing the work with Carlos and I have done a lot with the affinity groups. There was a question in the chat about, you know, affinity groups and promoting narratives there. And also in with faculty and staff, moving in that direction as well.
Brendan, why don't we start here with your question? Maybe you'd like to go ahead and ask it. Be better than hearing me read it. If you'd like to go ahead.
Sure. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. And I was just really interested in like how you noticed that these stories and hearing these stories impacted just your way of proceeding, or maybe even like your the way that you might advise, you know, the counseling department or other teachers or campus ministry service on how they structure their opportunities to build in maybe more time for a slower pace, for some listening. Just interested really in some reflections on that, if you would.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the best way to do that, I've noticed, is around topic. So whatever you're working on in class or in the community, whether it's around, you know, race, gender, gender identity, sexuality, disabilities. We've done talks. I've worked with students around sexual assault too, which is where they start to open around that. So I think that definitely you need to scaffold, even with faculty or with anybody you're doing this work with. You need to get them comfortable, because to share these stories, you're vulnerable. Students are vulnerable when they're sharing these very, very personal stories. So we don't just go into that right away. And the way I introduce it is we talk about the safe things that are talked about, like statistics. You know, before we talked about rape or sexual assault, I did a presentation and looking at statistics and how often does it affect middle schoolers or high schools or whatever, or racism. We did some work around that. And that's a very easy entryway for adults and for students. And then after that, to always model that meaning what I would do is I would grab Counterstories. There's so many online. If you guys need resources, I have a ton of resources, but I would grab excerpts from Counterstories that have been published, and also videos. There's many forms, by the way, music, poems, art, many forms that Counterstories can take. And I will share that with students or faculty and staff, just like you saw me do with you. And then as we go through the work, then that makes people more comfortable, because you definitely have to create a safe space for people to listen. I think a word that's been used with me that I love is healing spaces and humility spaces. I don't know if that helped, Brendan.
Yes, thank you so much. Absolutely.
And what other questions or insights do we have for Cora? And please feel free to just pop in.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Cora, Kristen, and others. I'm Lorraine from Sacred Heart Nativity School. So bring that middle school perspective. And I think I appreciated particularly my experience with the racism story and also the what's wrong with me, because we see it already in pre-secondary. And we're really trying to be intentional about bringing out their stories. So by the time they get to you all, there's that comfort level. What I would love to see is if this can be adopted in other schools, there's so much in the boys coming back to teach and to develop that or encourage our kids to be able to be comfortable with telling their story. We can guide them through that as best as possible as educators, but that would be just a dream to just have. I mean, that to me would be like very authentic high school community service, right? In terms of giving back and like running a Cura class or coming to speak at the middle school level, not necessarily with the nativity, but of course I'm always going to promote the nativity schools. But I really appreciate expanding our lens, and then really wishing and dreaming of the opportunity to take it to the pre-secondary level too.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Lorraine. As I've been doing at the beginning, when I first started teaching in the course, I didn't have much material. I didn't have any material from former students, but definitely as I continue to share student stories with each class, because when we get to the end of, gender identity, I'll share a couple of stories from their alum, and they are so moved. Now I give students the option, because they know I'm going to have their story, to when I share it, I tell them, share something you're comfortable sharing. If you don't want your name involved, and then I leave that open to like, please, you can share my story, but please don't use my name, especially at an all-boys school when it comes to gender identity. So many students have shared that please don't use my name. But, and then definitely, Lorraine, I think another idea would be to have them come back, alumni to come back as guest speakers. It would be, it's written is very powerful, right? But it would be so, even if it was on maybe Zoom, to have them come back and share, yeah, that would be a great thing to do next. Thank you.
Cora, I have a question about kind of pushback from parents when they start hearing their students talk about hearing these kinds of counter stories in their classes. How do you at your school deal with that? How would you recommend? I'm at Regis Jesuit in Colorado, and so I think as we've made a more intentional effort around this, we've heard some pushback from parents who think that we are falling out of step with our mission. So I'm just curious as to how to counter the counter story.
Yeah, thank you, Charisse. So I personally have not gotten pushback, but I know that the context that I do it is in smaller groups, right? First of all, it's a senior class that I teach, and they've elected into it. When Carlos and I do the diversity work, it's within the Unity Council, so it's like a safe space that we've created with the boys. But what I can say, I mean, you raise a really good question. I'm thinking first, like when I talk about healing spaces and humility spaces, I think they need to be done in smaller groups before brought to the broader community. Yeah, like I said, a lot of scaffolding. But I will say, as I've shared this information with different contexts, and I did this workshop at the NAIS, which is, just as you guys know, it's not Catholic or Christian. And yeah, there are adults who pushed back on me, like questioning what I was doing and why I was doing it. And I have to say, Charisse, I didn't know what to do. I did not know what to do except for to speak my truth about it, Yeah, I think that to answer what do you do with parents, I mean, that's so complex, right? Because you're dealing with this broader community and the administration. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you, and I'm sorry, but you do raise a good question, and I would recommend that this be done in smaller groups and contexts first.
Thank you, that was helpful. Even just to know that there's no clear path to an answer around that.
We have a couple more minutes together. Oh, sorry, please jump in.
I just wanted to say, in the context of talking about parents, I think it's important for parents to understand that they choose to send their child to the school. And so, the experience of being in the school says that we need to get to know everybody. And, especially when I know in some cases, in some schools, students are coming to our Jesuit schools, at least the high schools, without having had any experience of going to school with anybody except for their own culture. And so being able to come together means that we need to be able to know each other. And so, I know that's not an answer to a parent concern, but I think it's important for parents also to talk about telling their own stories. We had an experience years ago with, inviting some of our parents who were immigrants from Europe, immigrants from Central America, to speak about coming to the United States. And I think that really helped parents and students to hear those stories together, so maybe it's an invitation to parents to tell their own stories.
So I wanted to add, thank you, Cora, by the way, and hello all. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so, you mentioned already, Cora, that the stories are already among us, and I think they are. So one of the things that our advanced placement Spanish language and literature teacher does is she invites the parents of our students who have immigrated to this country, and they come in and share their stories. And so some of them have been, for example, highly educated in their home country, and they're working jobs that really don't allow them to use their education and background of experience here. Many have really kind of had to really grapple to gain a foothold here, and their sons are coming to Fairfield Prep. And so the audience is the class, and the class is a mixed group of students from all over Fairfield County. By the way, I'm coming to you from Connecticut. And, to be honest with you, those are our counter stories in a big way. And the guys that I sit in on as many of those as I can. Some of the parents are parents of students that I counsel. And what a moment. The parents become very emotional. The students ask questions that you wouldn't actually expect them to have. Well, they wouldn't ask it of their teacher. They wouldn't ask it of a school person, but they would ask it here. They're very curious to basically kind of get into the lives of those that are speaking to them. It's an awesome experience. I also think there are a lot of counter stories that happen on Kairos and on our retreats. And I have to tell you, a lot of those things start there and blossom here, meaning back in the general community. And so often our students are amazed by the things that are shared that are hidden. And so they assume the students all well put together, whatever it might be, or the family life or whatever it might be. So I think they're eye openers. So the stories are among us. I think if we're good listeners, and yes, Kairos small group and large groups are trust circles for sure. And I can see how important it would be to continue that small group. But sometimes those issues that come out there blossom into larger discussions here in our school community. So the counter stories are powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think also, in hearing that, and yeah, of course, stories from the broader community, but I think that a part of the work is just raising the awareness of when you hear something or students say something that are blanket statements, that we need to be aware. Like I try to tell students, no, I don't think that's the whole picture, and that in the TED Talk about the danger of a single story, she says, the dominant narratives, it's not that there's not truth to them. There could be an element of truth. She says the problem is they're not complete. And I think that's the essential part, to just keep raising that awareness that one story does not tell the whole story.
I'll just add, Cora, thank you so much. I've heard your talk so many times and I always love it. In response to that, it's also, Cora does a great job in also centering it on mission and on the foundation documents of who we are as Jesuit institutions. And if we're wanting to create communities in which everyone feels a sense of belonging, telling authentic stories of who we are, being our full selves, is important. So I just want to echo all that has been said, including also the counter stories, or like what Cora, you just said about the blanket statements that need to be challenged and addressed. In my Latin American studies class, students saying like, well, I don't understand why, you know, my family was able to make X, Y, or Z. And I said, well, great, that was your experience and I understand it. But in here, we're raising the awareness of different spaces and different situations. So it's all over. Like, we always need to all create those spaces for really authentic engagement. And I think what Cora does is truly amazing. And I'm a big fan.
I paid him to say that, guys. Just kidding. No, I think that it's as we come to the end of our session, I think it'll be easier to do this with students. They're more open to it. I think we need to start doing it like, was it you, somebody who was it? Lorraine, who said doing it in the lower grades as well. We need to start talking about these issues. I feel like we're doing a disservice if we don't start in lower grade levels. We can't start talking about race and racism or sexuality, gender identity, assault, or disabilities and wait until they're seniors. And I would say, guys, just from my experience, is a harder group to deal with this is faculty and staff. Adults are have very much, I mean, we're older, have very much bought into these dominant narratives. And it's more challenging to do the work with adults.
I will be mindful of our time here. I know everyone's got to get to various classes and appointments, so I think we will conclude here. But what a wonderful gift the virtual space is to get to listen and reflect on these ideas on a Tuesday afternoon in December. I think that's really terrific. So, you know, as we leave, I would say the ideas of listening, of hidden stories versus shared stories, of creating space for our authentic learning, of engaging lower grade levels. I mean, all the terrific stuff that came up today through Cora sharing her work. I hope it's been an energizing hour for you and time well spent. So many thanks to Cora for all of her time here. Many thanks to all of you. We will be recording this and sharing it around, so I'll make sure you get a copy of it if you want to pass it along to your colleagues who weren't able to be with us. But thank you so much. Many blessings for a happy and healthy Christmas and New Year. Take care, everyone.